This is Suno India production. You can now listen to all our episodes on our Android and iPhone app. Download it now.
That is a song by the band Imphal Talkies. The song describes the Burmese invasion of Manipur in 1819, an invasion that led to the period known as the 7-year devastation in the history of Manipur. On 26 July 1947, the Kingdom of Manipur passed the Manipur Constitution Act. The constitution was drafted over a 2-month period by a 15-member constitution-making committee. With this constitution, the Maharaja, or the King of Manipur, adopted a more ceremonial role, akin to that of the President in our current constitution, and most legislative powers were transferred to an elected assembly. However, just about 2 years later, this constitution was abrogated, and the Maharaja and Manipur were faced with the limits of constitutionalism. On this episode of Contested Nation, we discuss the only modern Indian state to pass its own independent constitution, the circumstances under which this constitution expired, and what that teaches us about the limits of constitutionalism.
Hello and welcome to Contested Nation, a podcast that discusses how the Constitution of India was written and how that remains relevant for India today. I'm Shruti, your host. This podcast is produced by Suno India in collaboration with the Equals Project.
Joining us for this very important season finale, we are honored to have Dr. Malem Ningthouja. Dr. Malem received his BA Honours History from the Hindu College in Delhi and his MA and MPhil and PhD in History from the University of Delhi. He is currently a member of the Editorial Board of the journal Revolutionary Democracy, the Founder-cum-Chairperson of the Campaign for Peace and Democracy, the Founder-cum-Managing Trustee of the Labour Research and Organisation Foundation, an alternate member of the International Coordination Committee of the International League of People's Struggle. He is also a member of the Coordination of Democratic Rights Organization, the Committee for the Release of Political Prisoners, and the Indian History Congress. That's a very impressive introduction indeed, Dr. Malem. Thank you so much for joining us today. So we'll begin this episode, Dr. Malem, by talking a little bit about the political history of Manipur, especially pre-1947. So Manipur for the British was part of the northeastern frontier. Its attention mainly to this region was drawn due to the Burmese invasions in Assam and Manipur. And after 1824, Manipur became a protectorate state of the British. In 1891, the Anglo-Manipur War was fought, which Manipur lost. And after this, there was indirect rule in Manipur by the British. Dr. Malem, could you talk us a little bit through this period of Manipur's history, its political history, and how political decision-making is taking place in this region at the time?
Great. Actually, Manipur-British connections begin sometimes in 1762, when India was still almost being highly influenced and ruled by the East India Company. The political tussles between the Awa, the Burmese kingdom, and the Manipur kingdom have been very long. And as the Burmese invasions started to penetrate into Manipur time and again, from the late 18th centuries onward, the Manipur kingdom sought the support of the British. So a treaty alliance took place in 1762 between the Manipuri king and the representative of the East India Company in 1762. Unfortunately, the terms and agreements of the treaty could not be materialized, and there was a big pause for some decades in terms of the international relation between Manipur Kingdom and the British. But as you correctly pointed out, Burmese invasions to Manipur took place in 1819, and they kept on ruling Manipur for 7 years, completely devastating. And many desertions took place, including the princes and all who sought refuge in Kasar and other neighboring kingdoms. And the help came in 1824, and British wanted to help Manipur for their own reasons. And there is a long history to that. I'll not go into that. But after 1824, an unequal treaty alliance occurred between East India Company and the Manipur king, and that's how, during the first Anglo-Burmese War, Manipur becomes an important war front, and Manipur got liberated from the Burmese rule in 1826, right? And Manipur, of course, as you pointed out, in 1824, following the treaty alliance, and we don't have a record of what exactly were the treaties, but we all knew that the help from British were coming in terms of raising up Manipur Levy. That's an army battalion, 500 people, giving with more sophisticated arms and etc. So it was a kind of military alliance. But military alliance was just the beginning. And after 1826, we began to find lots of unequal treaty alliances, starting from, if you read the Acheson treaties and all them, starting from 1833 and etc., there were treaties, notable treaties. That's how Manipur became a protectorate state. The British almost taking over the external affairs in terms of giving military support and diplomacy and etc. A series of treaties were signed after 1833.
Malem, I'm curious if you could shed a little bit of light also around the internal political structures. We know that there's a Raja of Manipur. We know that there's a state Darbar that's operating at this time. What is the relationship between the two in pre-1947 Manipur?
You were talking lastly about the post-Anglo-Manipur War process, right? So you want to know about that. And we all knew that after the Anglo-Manipur War, 1891, the old generations and the ruling classes, not the ruling classes, but the ruling families were all terminated. They were exiled. Some were killed in the war, including the top military officers, etc. So after Anglo-Manipur War, what I found was a completely different setup being arranged by the British. They chose their own handpicked to become the Raja of Manipur, the King of Manipur. And the King of Manipur was a very minor, so the British kept them under regency. Now see, if you're talking about the internal arrangements, political arrangements, let me try to give you a brief political economic systems prevailing at that point of time. As I study history, I find three systems coming in. One, you have the merchant capitalists of the British finding an inroad into Manipur. Then you have the feudal systems prevailing predominantly in the hill areas. And also that's the period where, the three mode of production systems were coexisting at that point of time. One, you have the feudal, purely feudal type of economy. Well, it may be different from what the Europeans have experienced, but it's a feudal phenomenon of feudal mode of productions. And you have tribal mode of productions in the hills. And by tribal mode of productions, I do not mean that there were not feudal elements. There were also feudal elements in the hill areas, but predominantly saying one, capitalist systems coming inroads, transplanting itself into the pre-existing two systems of mode of productions. One, as I pointed out, the feudal economy, and the other, the tribal economy. The three were trying to co-opt each other, and the capitalist inroads taking an upper hand. So predominantly in the valley areas, what we found after 1891 was a monarchy system with the Darbar as assisting or ruling in the name of the king, right? It was like a council of ministers which were playing some kind of executive roles on the one hand and the advisory roles on the other hand. And it is in the Darbar that the British officers were also playing a very key important role. First, as a vice president of the Darbar, later on as a president of the Darbar, but ruling in the name of in the name of the king. So now there was, after 1891, British inroads, finding their own collaborators, with the king as the topmost positions, and other upbringing landlord aristocratic elements occupying key positions in the Darbar, and also incorporating many hill tribes through the Darbar.
I know that just before this recording, Malem, you and I were talking about tribal identities in Manipur, something that you just touched upon right now. And, we hear about the Métis, the Nagas, the Kukis, and what we read in, I would say, popular history is some of the struggles or some of the divisions between them. But I know, Malem, that you have a deeper understanding of these tribal identities and how they played out into the political situation in Manipur pre-1947. So if you can elaborate a little bit more on that, that would be great.
Now, after 1824, the demarcations of Manipur's territory was a phenomenal experience, with the British playing an important role. Prior to that, every kingdom has a boundary, but there was no fixed demarcated boundaries as one would have expected in the advanced industrial societies like Europe and all. There were cartographies and imaginary lines and etc. And the extent of the rules depends on the might of the king, right? But the fixed territory, as we come to know today, with proper demarcated lines, with mapping systems, and the boundary pillars were taking place during British era, starting from 1826 onwards. Now, if you talk of tribal identities in the pre-1947 period, one thing that I would like to point it out is that the nomenclatures called the Nagas and Kukis identity, as many of you would be reading today, were largely colonial constructs. There were tribes in Manipur, but the tribes were known by their own names. And phenomenologically speaking, it was during British rule, starting lastly from around 1840s and 50s, that many so-called Kukis were being transplanted as settler colonialists in Manipur. But they were, from Manipur's perspective, they were known by their own villages or by their tribal names. But of course, the as the political situation keeps on changing, I don't know whether we will call it tribal identities, but still, yes, the identity formations were taking place. Even Meitei identity as we know today were constructs in 20th century. Prior to that, as I could see in the valley areas, there were Bangals, that's the Manipur Muslims, which were not known as Meitei. They were Bamons, lastly descendants of the Brahmins or peoples that we know as Mayans. But they adapted to the local situations, but they were not known as Meiteis. And there were other groups like the Lois and Yaitivis, which were caste peoples. They were not recognized as Meiteis. The Meiteis per se were known as Kretiyas. Then you have the Brahmins and other communities. Within Meiteis, there was no caste system. But as I pointed out, as time changes and the identity politics keeps on changing, today the Bamons and even the Bangals and the Lois and Yaitivis were all now grouped under the Meitei nomenclatures. Likewise, due to the prevailing situations during the colonial period, and particularly after 1947, the Kukis and the Nagas' identity keep on concretizing, and these were largely colonial constructs. But if you go deeper, there were also Nepalis still living, quite old, and then migrants from other parts of India. I'm talking about the pre-1947 period. And although we keep on giving, some kind of the Nagas and political identities, there were also several tribes today which begin to assert their identity freed from either the larger overarching Kuki identities or Naga identities. This keep on changing. But it's true that identity formations have been, taking place in Manipur, particularly in the first half of the 20th century for various reasons.
I think that's a really important point about how complex identities can be and how, looking back at a different period of time, we bring our own constructs to that identity, which maybe didn't exist at the time. So we bring our own perspective and our own lens. But what's clear, I think, Malem, from your answer is that identity formation is complex, is dynamic, and is slowly becoming more rampant within Manipur in pre-1947 Manipur, rather. And what we can see is towards the end of colonial rule, there's a struggle for power between various groups in this region. The rulers of the valley, the rural peasantry, the landed aristocracy. There's a growing educated elite, some of whom have come together to form the Manipur State Congress. And there's a slowly brewing struggle for power here. And in 1939, we have the second Nupilan. That is the second uprising of Manipuri women, sort of taking off from the first Nupilan, which was in 1905. And interestingly, the leader of this struggle is a man called Irabat Singh, who is the son-in-law of the Maharaja of Manipur.
Utpirami lamben, uhandirami manglan, pibirami thongna, kangan birami khang makanba, yamahana haure lambel, manglak narakle manglan, sontha haure thongna, kangjil laktre awa nungaiba, homsalasi panthuk yaudaba, mangpongna laje manglamba manglan, aplaudo thona, illese matum, pangtholasi thaudang pamjaramba lambianba laching purelu.
That's a poem on Irabat Singh called Our Beloved Leader, commissioned by the Manipur government on the occasion of his 125th birthday. Irabat's vision, as we understand it, is to make Manipur an independent republic. Malem, can you talk to us a little bit more about Irabod Singh, his rise to political power, and his vision for Manipur and the larger region itself?
Well, you have pointed out some trends, and I would like to make a very short response to that before focusing on Irabod. Despite the identity politics, you're talking about the elites and etc. From 1940s onwards, there was, I should say, from Marxist point of view, the formations of the political community was taking shape through alliances and understandings being drawn, particularly among the so-called elites. And you were talking about the constitution and etc., which in fact Irabod really pointed out to be the handiwork of the British. You were talking about the end of the colonial rule as well. But if you see Irabod and etc., the colonial rule did not come to an end in 1947. And many people, there were 2-3 versions on that. Some people believe that colonial rule came to an end in 1947 and there was restorations of sovereignty. But there were others who were denying the achievement of any kind of sovereignty. There are people who continue to believe that there was transfer of powers and colonial rule has continued to exist even 1947. And then you also pointed out something called the 1939 Nupiland event. The Nupiland agitation, literally Nupiland means war, but we said it was an agitation, not war in the conventional sense that we understand today. And you were also talking about the identity politics. What you find very interesting at this point of time in 1939 is that, let me stress a little bit on the history so that it's more clear. When British came, they were mostly military officers. But I was pointing about how capitalist inroads were taking place. Merchant capitalists were being imported, and they happened to be largely, in the first batch, as far as I know, happens to be from Bengal, the castes and communities and all. And later on, from 1930s onward, particularly on the eve of Second World War, it happens to be the Marwari communities. They were monopoly traders. And directly, the products from the outside, the commodities coming from outside were welcome in Manipur, but there were challenges to the monopoly being enjoyed by these immigrants, particularly the trading communities. And these trading communities were recognized as British Indian subjects, and they were given special protection in the British reserve areas. And there was a tussle between the migrants and the local traders, particularly from the women's sections and etc. Because we had social and economic systems where women plays a dominant role in the economy, particularly in trading communities and all. So prior to that, 1939, in 1920 we had bazaar boycott, particularly directed against the castes because of their monopoly and profiteering activities. There were resistance from the local communities. So I would say that it was an extension of the anti-merchant monopoly capitalism's monopoly being enjoyed by the British Indian subjects. And in 1939, the agitation took place centered around the heavy export of rice being, the monopoly being enjoyed by the Marwari traders because of their new electric rice mills and the manner how they collaborated with the local rice producers, paddy producers, and etc. That's the environment where the sentiments took place. And I don't know if Irabod actually was a leader, but he was a very influential man at that point of time because of the reform movements and his personalities and his prominent roles in the field of sports, art, and drama. He was a popular figure. In fact, that's why, despite being an orphan, he was offered a princess as his wife. He was carrying out significant reform movements. He was very influential, but I don't know if the December 12, 1939 episode was ignited by him or not. In fact, considering he was not in Manipur at that point of time. But when he came back, and when he began to play and give lectures and all, it had a catalyzing and a very significant remark, it seems. That must be the reasons why. For political reasons, he had already resigned from his post of this membership to the Sadar Panchayat Court and etc. The prestigious post, he had already resigned because he wanted to bring up the Nikhil Manipuri Mahasabha from a cultural platform to a political platform. For that reasons and because of his political influence and the likely roles that he might be playing at a situation when the Second World War had almost begun, that he had to be booked for seditious and for other reasons, and he had to be jailed and exiled to some other places and all. But I don't know if he was the real leader of that the spark that's occurred on December 12th. I'm not denying that he is very leadership, playing important leadership role, but it may be totally unfair in the absence of any documentary proof to suggest that he was the one instigating the December 12th, 1939 event. Yeah. And that's the clarification I would like to make.
And I think that's really important, that his political leadership within Manipur was important, but within the Nupilan itself, it was maybe less important or less started by him, and more a broader struggle against certain political and economic injustices that were being perceived by certain parts of the population at the time, as you pointed out. So let's stay with Irabad Singh for just a minute more, Malem. Can you talk to us a little bit more about Irabad's significance more widely politically, and what his vision for independent republic was?
He began as a rebellion against injustice while he was still a student in class 6th, 7th, right? And then he went to Sylhet and studied there for 1 or 2 years, but he was more interested in the peasant movements in Surma Valley and all. That's what we heard, and that's what we find in history. After that, he came back to Manipur. He began to introduce lots of things in sports, in arts and drama, in journalism, in poetry writings, and in academic writings, and etc. But from 1934 onwards, he began to organize cultural fronts like the Nikhil Manipuri Hindu Mahasabha and began to play important role in social reform movements, particularly against federal operations, I should be saying, focusing mainly on the cultural and religious issues. That's how he began to take steps in reform movement. But after 1938, he began to show political content in the cultural organization. That's why the king moved away from that organization, and rules were imposed saying that any government servant cannot play an important role in the organization. They must leave the Nikhil Manipuri Mahasabha. Yeah, prior to that, it was Nikhil Manipuri Hindu Mahasabha, but then in 1938, they got changed it into Nikhil Manipuri Mahasabha, deleting the Hindu. And the Raja moved away from that and imposed a ban on government officers joining it. But Irabad and some of his colleagues like Atom Bapu Sharma, etc., who were playing important role in this Sabha, they resigned from the government post and they continue with the agitation. But after 1939, as you pointed out, and particularly from 1940 when he was jailed for giving a speech in support of the in support of the women's war, Nupila, that he was jailed. And it was also a period where the Nikhil Manipuri Mahasabha got divided on whether the Sabha would be giving open political support to Nupilan and all. Irabad said we should give direct political support and etc. And so like the division have already started within Nikhil Hindi Manipuri Mahasabha. And some of them will be playing important roles later on in forming Manipur State Congress and etc., while Irabot would be moving away to a different political trend. After he was exiled from Manipur, and he was kept in Sylhet jail in 1940, and he was in jail till 1943, I think. It was there that he began to meet with the Indian communists, and he became indoctrinated with the communist principles and belief and all, and then he became a communist and came back as a communist. That's the total different shift in his political career. He began as a sports player, as a dramatist, as an artist, and as a poet and as a journalist, then became a social reformer, trying to change the society through reforms within the system. And he got jailed for that, and later on he became a communist, totally now challenging the systems when he wanted to overthrow the entire system. But you said that he wanted to create a pan-Mongoloid kind of platforms to liberate from India. I don't know about that because I don't find any trend of that. But he was there for the sovereignty of Manipur. He was fighting the Indian government, terming the Nehru government as a fascist and all, and he was trying to make alliances with the Burmese communist parties. Prior to that, yes, he was very active in some parts of the Assam where he even fought elections as a communist candidate. He was one of the pioneering figure, in fact, a communist pioneering figure from Northeast India, I should say, because he attended both the first and the second Congress of the Communist Party of India. The first one that was held in Bombay, and the second one that was held in Kolkata. He was there as a cultural scout, and he was, as I pointed out, he fought elections from Kasar as a communist candidate. So he tried to, he took a parliamentarian line that I should be pointing out within the Indian system, within the colonial system or whatever it is. But he became, I think, frustrated with the system, and he took a different line now, directly challenging the Indian constitutions. And it's been pointed out that he stood for a sovereign Manipur. That's the shift in his political career.
Malem, shift gears a little bit from Irabot and the incredibly complicated political picture that you just painted within Manipur at the point, to the Manipur Constitution Act itself, which to me is just incredibly fascinating as a legal and political exercise. So, just to set the context for this a little bit, to draft the Constitution of Manipur, a committee was established in February 1947. The decision was approved by the then Governor of Assam, who was a representative of the British, and the committee itself was a 15-member body headed by F.F. Pearson, a British civil servant, and included 5 representatives each from the hill and valley regions of Manipur state. The draft produced by the committee was adopted as the Manipur State Constitution Act in May 1947. I want to also briefly touch upon certain features of this constitution. The constitution relegated the monarch to the role of a constitutional head, similar to that of the monarchy in England, and real political power was vested in the state assembly and a council of ministers. The constitution provided for a state assembly for a 3-year term, and this assembly would be elected on the basis of adult franchise. 36% of the seats were to be filled by people from the hilly regions, and a majority was required from these representatives in matters relating to the region itself. Executive power was vested in the State Council of Ministers, consisting of 6 ministers elected by the State Assembly and a Chief Minister, who would be appointed by the Maharaja in consultation with the Council of Ministers. Notably, the constitution had a lot of features of what we would call our current constitution, including a chapter on fundamental rights, on duties of citizenship. Like the current Indian constitution, the Manipur constitution also guaranteed equality and liberty to its citizens. It provided for freedom of thought, worship, association, and action, subject, of course, to law and public morality. Interestingly, the constitution had a clause that read, capital punishment may not be inflicted for purely political crimes. In a pretty, I would say, progressive, liberal constitution, containing all the parts of a constitution that we expect there to be today, whether it's around fundamental rights, whether it's around guarantees of the state. And as per the Manipur State Constitution Act, the first elections took place in June 1948 based on adult franchise. And in October 1948, a 53-member assembly met for the first time in the Darbar Hall of the Royal Palace. Malem, can you walk us through popular reaction within Manipur to this constitution? How was it received? And what are the key political parties that are taking part in this process at the time?
Now, you're talking about Manipur Constitution Act, 1947. It was, in fact, a colonial creation accepted by large sections of the Manipur political elites, educated elites at that point of time, who were working in collaboration with the British rule. Well, as I pointed out, there was no objection from the dominant political elites at that point of time, cutting across communities and representatives. But as I pointed out, it was the what I found it was the kind of a successful national bourgeois democratic transitions from the monarchy systems to a constitutional monarchy, which was largely a creation of the British. Because the British from time to time had been trying to impose what is being called reforms, administrative and political reforms in Manipur. And there was a rigorous attempts to reform starting from 1940s onwards. From time to time, they keep on introducing reforms. And just on the eve of the adoptions of the constitutions, we have something called Manipur Administration Rules, 1947, being enforced on 1st July 1947. And what you call as the Constitution of Manipur was largely an improvement of that administrative rules. And Irabot pointed out that it was not a Manipur Constitution Act, but rather what he pointed out as the F.M. Pearson's Constitutional Act. He pointed it out. I don't say that it was not progressive. It was progressive at that point of time. Now you are transforming Manipur from a completely monarchical system to a constitutional monarchy system. In that sense, it was progressive. But the Irabot was not satisfied with this Manipur constitution, and he pointed out that there was lacking in the civil and political fundamental rights. These were not elaborated. That's what he pointed out. And yes, election took place in the hills and in the valleys and the hills, and a Manipur Legislative Assembly was ceremonially established on 18th October 1948. Yes, it's true, but there were no 53 members at the point of time. One got defected. So it was only 52. And within that 52, the Irabot was forced to go underground. So it was only 51. To point it out statistically, he didn't attend the assembly. He was forced to go underground. And instead, he wrote a letter to the assembly on the inaugurations of the assembly. He wrote a letter to the assemblies where he pointed out why he was not happy with the constitution, but still he had a faith in the assembly and was requesting the assembly to build up the united Manipur.
So,
Pointed
Malem,
out. So yes.
I can sense your skepticism or Irabot skepticism from your answer.
Yes, simultaneous to the Manipur Constitution Act, we also have, Manipur Courts Act 1947, Manipur State Courts Act 1947, and we also have Manipur Hill Areas Regulation Act 1947, Hill Areas Regulation Administrative Act, and etc. And if you pointed out, the question is whether Manipur got complete sovereignty after 1947 or not. That's the big question. And if you pointed out that, as I pointed out, that the constitution was largely the creation of British in collaboration with the local elites. No doubt it was progressive at that point of time, but still the British grips continue to still exist there. They were imposing their own system, their own belief systems. It was not evolved from Manipur, but rather being, directly transplanted from above, something that being made from above. That's what I was trying to say. And then I figure out that even in the Manipur Courts Act, the criminal punishment, when it comes to capital punishments, the High Court, if they give them capital punishment, that capital punishment has to be approved by the Maharaja. And that's not enough. That capital punishment, despite being approved by the Manipur Chief Court and the Maharaja, has to be approved by the agent of the Dominion of India. Right? So it was some kind of limited sovereignty or limited autonomy or whatever it is of the bourgeois character. It was a bourgeois democratic constitutions where the British continued to play an important upper hand. And when I say about British, it was largely dominant of India, right? After 1947, India have not quite completely become the sovereign People's Republic. It becomes only after 1950. When the constitution was adopted. Prior to that, still the British will continue to exert a lot of pressure, both in Pakistan and India. So you have two dominions. That's the kind of setup, and it is in that environment that Irabot, although accepted the constitution, although took part in the elections, and won the election, but still had lots of reservations on the constitutions and was expecting to bring about a lot of changes in the constitutions.
Yeah. And I mean, to be fair, the sort of criticisms are valid even, or are things that are spoken about even about the Indian constitution, right?
Yes.
That it was dominated by certain elites, that it did speak a language that was maybe not understood by the common population, that a lot of the concepts were borrowed from foreign constitutions or from the Government of India Act 1935. And so, and whether it was truly a popular constitution, because it's not, the members of the assembly are not elected by adult franchise. It's indirect elections and then the members of the assembly, right? So those are, I think, even within the larger Indian constitution making process, criticisms that are lobbied not just today, but even while the assembly is drafting, there are members of the assembly themselves who are asking these questions, who are asking what the legitimacy and the validity of the constitution and the constitution making process is. So that's really fascinating to see that mirror within Manipur and Manipur's Constitution Act.
Yes, you were asking about popular response, see, I don't know how do we measure popular response. I mean, which the yardstick of measuring popular response? But no doubt, I don't find any resistance to the constitutions, and it's believed that many people took part in the elections. They cast votes. It means sometimes when there is an absence of resistance, it means the consent, right? So we lastly talk about adult franchise, and many people got elected in the valley and the hills also. But given the present trend of the electoral politics in the hill areas, particularly the remote areas, even today, where the chiefs cast vote on behalf of the citizens entirely in the village areas, or where muscle powers and the money powers plays an important role, I really don't know we don't have a survey of how was the people's response in 1947, but no doubt, there was no resistance to the electoral politics. There was long discussions about, you were talking about 2-3 months of discussions in the Manipur Constitution making committee and etc. for drafting the constitutions. To me, it seems that the constitutions were already prepared by the British. The constitution making draft committee was only approving what were being prepared for them to accept. But yes, it lasted more than 2 months. It was dissolved only in 1948, I think, mid-October or May. The Constitution Drafting Committee was dissolved only after that. Prior to that, they were, the levels of the subcommittee on the adult franchise or elections, the discussions there was more extensive than discussing really about the contents of the Constitution. So, but yes, as I pointed out, that there was no resistance to the election. There was no reported resistance to the election. So we would believe that yes, the people generally largely accepted the constitutions. They were quite favorable because they were largely influenced by the elites and the local communities. Like we were living about the 1949. The chief will cast on behalf of the villages. Or in the clan system, even in the valley, the elders will decide for the people. Could be. I don't know. I mean, there was no proper survey on election, but yes, people accepted it.
For all its pros and cons, unfortunately, the constitution didn't last very long.
No.
And on 21st September 1949, Maharaja Bhochandra Singh signed the merger agreement with the Indian Union.
It was on this day in 1949 that the Maharaja of Manipur, Bodh Chandra Singh, signed merger agreement with the Union of India, and as a result of the agreement, the Manipur state merged into the Indian Union as a Part C state with effect from 15th October 1949.
Later, the state was given a substantial measure of local self-government under the Territorial Councils Act of 1956, a legislative body, and Council of Ministers in 1963 and full statehood in 1972.
Now, the scale of the merger and the signing of the merger is heavily contested. We know that there are some who claim that the Raja was in effect kidnapped and that his signature was obtained without consultation with the Council of Ministers and without the consultation of the Assembly. So, therefore, it was constitutionally invalid. Others will claim that the Maharaja was still the titular head of the state, that he had the legal authority to enter into the accession agreement. I know, Malem, that your scholarship has thrown some much needed nuance onto this debate. Could you please walk us through the events of 1949 and how this merger with the Indian Union comes about, especially in light of what we've just discussed in terms of the powers of the Manipur State Constitution Act?
So number one, the making of India has been a long process starting from the British time onwards. Right, you have 1935 Act and all, and the agenda of forming something called Council of India, a Chamber of Princes, and the Federations of India, etc. These proposals were there. And the Indian National Congress, in collaboration with the British rulers, were playing a very key role in the making of India, particularly after 1947. And the attempts have been on the eve of the independence, that the princely, so-called the Indian princely states should come under one of the dominions, either in Pakistan or in India. But it seems to me from all these accounts that the British were also favoring most of the princely states to be with the dominion of India, and there was heavy pressure on the ruling princes from that time. So they call it integration project or whatever it is by the integration theorists. And on the eve of the independence, when it comes to Manipur's local context, We have two processes here. On the one hand, granting of constitutions and making it a constitutional monarch, means giving more legitimacy to the councils of the ministers and the assemblies being elected by the people. This process is there. On the other hand, there was a secret arrangement being made by the British in collaboration with the Indian national leaders, particularly from the INC and all, trying to take over Manipur at any cost through fair or unfair means. That process was there. So they secretly entered into alliance, starting from 1935 onwards. There was an attempt. And it seems to me that the king of Manipur and the Darbar were willing to join some kind of India. I don't know what will be the structures and the arrangement within that. I don't know. But what I found in the document was that they were willing to join some kind of Council of India or some kind of Federation of India. And in 1946, when the Indian Constituent Assembly was formed, the Manipur's king was willing to join the Constituent Assembly. There was an approach to join, and they were quite willing to join. But unfortunately, Manipur could not be represented directly. Both Manipur and Tripura was represented by someone from Tripura called Girish Chandra Guha, I think, if I remember the name correctly. He represented it on behalf of Manipur. And the Manipur king did not resist it. He wrote letters to Jawaharlal Nehru saying that we want a full representation, but Nehru rejected it. So finally he had to accept with it, and somebody was elected nominated, three of them were nominated from Manipur as an advisor to Guha. And in the Constituent Assembly debates, as I browsed through all the entire debates, this Guha represented Manipur and Tripura only 2 times to give credentials to the constitutions. There was no debate being raised from the point of view. This is what I figure out from the entire both legislative debates and the Constitutional Assembly debates starting from those periods carried out by the Constituent Assembly. Now, so I was saying that the policy to take over Manipur was there, and Manipur king and some of the elites were quite willing to accept the takeover, and they were making arrangements for that. I don't think the people were aware of this, right? Then what happened? Before jumping into 21st September, they were following certain procedural norms. Now the Manipur king have sent indirect representative to the Constituent Assembly. Then on 1st July 1947, prior to independence, the king of Manipur signed what is being called standstill agreement, which kept certain agreements between British and Manipur intact to be continued by the Dominion of India. And then on 11 August, if I remember correctly, the Instrument of Accession was signed. It means many of the laws passed by the British colonial ruler had to be continued under the suzerainty of the Dominion of India. It was some kind of arrangement, with Manipur still enjoying some kind of limited sovereignty. And then the whole episode of the 21st September merger agreement took place. It was secretly done, in fact. Well, the king of Manipur was called to Shillong, and there is a whole narrative which supposed that he was being forced and coerced upon to sign the agreement at any cost. But the king signed it, and he did not resist it after he had signed it. And there were terms and of the privy purses where the king, after endorsing the draft agreement, had to write to the British saying that, this much amount of compensation has to be increased for my privy purse and etc. So, literally speaking, he accepted it. But, he resisted it to the maximum level. He was pleading the Indian negotiators to let him go back to Manipur and consult the ministers and etc. But the Indian rulers, particularly dominant of India's representative, had a different mind. They had to be signed at any cost through, use of military forces or whatever it is. But it remains a secret agreement. It was not being informed to the Manipur public. So you see, that agreement had occurred, violating completely the Manipur Constitution Act, and right. What happened after 1949, the 15th October, was that the entire assembly was dissolved, and Manipur's limited sovereignty, or whatever it is, was completely dissolved, and Manipur's identity was completely downgraded from either quote-unquote sovereign or limited sovereignty to a completely central ruled state, Part C status, being ruled by a chief commissioner, which continued, though keep on upgraded from time to time till 1972, when Manipur was completely kept as a constituent state of the Indian Union from 21st January 1972.
I think that's, the sort of tragedy of it is Manipur went from having an independent constitution to not even having full voting powers when it became a Part C state. It takes much longer till the 1970s, as you pointed out, Malem, for Manipur and Manipuri people to get that right within the Indian Union.
Maybe for various compulsive reasons or whatever it is, that's a different thing. But reading from the integrationist point of view and reading the electoral statistics and the levels of democratic demands within the constitutional framework from time to time onwards through bourgeois democratic reforms or whatever it is, then, well, most of the people, I should be saying, for various reasons, had identified themselves to be Indian citizens. There is no doubt. But reading it from a totally different perspective, then we would see that insurgency has not died out. It still exists, and it's still getting materialized. And if you see the government's repressive machineries and the repressive laws, then we see still things that the levels of militarizations and the policing and the restrictions to freedom of expressions and civil and political rights are continued to be restricted for reasonable reasons from the perspectives of the states. So, right? So we have three phenomena here. One, as I pointed out, the kind of democratic demands within the constitutional systems, the levels of participations in the elections, and people's applying for jobs in the army, bureaucracy, white-collar job. It will all appear to be that, most people are willing to accept being Indians, and they're quite happy with that. That's number one. Number two, insurgency continue to exist, cannot be wiped out. Number three, repressions and freedoms of restrictions on the freedom of expression, etc., continue to be very intensifying. Now, if I go, or if you say that, like now today, let there be a plebiscite to decide on the political future of Manipur. Will the government of India accept it? If it is confident enough that the entire peoples have now been completely Indianized or become, and from the staticist point of view, will the Indian government still ready to accept it, like as it was in United Kingdoms, where the Scottish were given an opportunity to express their political will? Will the government of India ready to do that? So it seems to me that despite all the statistical accounts, the government in India still is doubtful about the faith in the loyalty of the people of Manipur or wherever it is where insurgents exist. So it's a very complex phenomena. Right?
Yeah.
So what I want to point it out is that let's give 5 years chance for freedom of expressions and free will expressions and the existence of civil and political liberties in the strict sense of the liberal terms. And after 5 years, let's decide with a plebiscite whether peoples of Manipur would still want to be with India or not. Only then we will be able to say that, what's the exact percentage of people still happy with being India or unhappy with India. Without that, it's very, it would be an interpretation and based on my own polemics to give an exact adjustment, to really point it out, whether the people are satisfied or not. It's very difficult. I don't know what you think, but I think it's very complex.
I think that's a fantastic note to end this conversation on, that it is really complex, that it's evolving. People's own perceptions of their identity, their relationship with other identities is evolving. And, that this constitution making process that this podcast often deals with, it's not really entirely a legal process. There is a lot of real political process involved in it, besides just drafting of the clauses and debates on specific legal clauses. The politics of drafting constitutions is really complex, and that any constitution making process needs to be located both in the legal and the political reality, and also accept that these realities are constantly evolving, they're constantly changing, that they're not static. And I think today, Malem, through this conversation and through exploring the events in Manipur, we've really highlighted that process today. So thank you so much for enlightening us. Honestly, for me, I learned a lot through this conversation, and I walk away with fairly complex feelings about what constitutions mean and what the limits of constitutions are, in India at least. So thank you so much, Malem.
And with that, we come not just to the end of this episode, but the end of this season of Contested Nation. Please do rate, review us, and you can even leave comments under each episode by downloading the Suno India app. If you liked Contested Nation, then please don't forget to check out all the other great content that Suno India is producing. If you want to learn more about the Constitution and the Constituent Assembly debates, then do follow the Equals Project on Instagram at the.equals.project or follow us on Twitter at Equals Project. Thank you for listening in.
Thank you for listening to this episode. You can now listen to all our episodes on our Android and iPhone app. Download it now.